Hello and welcome to Justice. I'm Lisa Booth filling in tonight for Judge Jeanine Pirro. And thank you for being with us. Two stories breaking tonight. Things stay peaceful as thousands protest a conservative free speech rally in Boston. Plus, a second police officer has died in Florida, one day after his colleague was killed while both were out on patrol. Tonight, we'll talk about all of it. A full plate of guests on deck, including Colonel Alan West. But joining me now with reaction to all of the breaking news, plus the latest big shakeup in the White House, Republican New York Congressman Lee Zeldin. Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So I want to get
with you.
Thank you. So I want to get your thoughts. Steve Bannon did an interview with the Weekly Standard. I want to show you a quote, and I want to get your thoughts on it. As you can see there, the Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over. We still have a huge movement, and we will make something of this Trump presidency. But that presidency is now over. So, Congressman, my question to you is, what's next in this Bannon-less chapter for President Trump?
Well, Steve Bannon still can play a really important role getting the message out on the priorities that he was fighting for on behalf of the president that still need to be done for the American people. Getting tax reform over the finish line over these next few months is key. He can play a part of that. Steve Bannon was someone, spent time with him, he would be passionately speaking about combating the BDS movement. He's pro-Israel. He talks about how we could go in a better direction with the Iran nuclear deal, or we could be negotiating better trade policies. Even though he's moving on, he still can play an important role talking about those issues. Within the White House, you need to have the best possible effort on all parts, led by a four-star Marine general to be able to deliver not just for a president, but more importantly for the American people. I don't believe that the Trump presidency is over by a long shot. This president has a lot of big wins already under his belt, confirming Neil Gorsuch, signing dozens of bills, keeping Americans safe from an attack, an economy that is growing, and he's just going to keep on racking up big wins. And for those who want to say that he hasn't accomplished anything or he won't accomplish anything, they're dead wrong, and the president's going to prove them wrong day after day with the weeks that are ahead.
Well, you talked about some of the things that Steve Bannon was fighting for. We know that he was an economic nationalist, things like trade, build the wall, America first. Do those priorities change at all for this administration with his exit?
Well, no, because Steve Bannon happens to be someone whose priorities, in many respects, were most in line with President Trump's priorities. President Trump isn't going to stop fighting for securing our border and building a wall. He's not going to stop fighting for a better path forward on negotiating trade deals with other countries, trade deals that are best for the American economy, American workers, most importantly. So I believe because there was so much symmetry on their priorities of fighting for the American people, the priorities that got President Trump elected last November, that the president's going to keep fighting for it. And there are a lot of people who agree with President Trump on these priorities who are going to help get it across the finish line, both inside the West Wing and out.
And Congressman, switching gears, you have been catching some heat for supporting what President Trump said in the sense that, there are violent sides, different violent sides there in Charlottesville. Virginia, do you worry, there's been universal condemnation, as there should be, for the members of the KKK, these white supremacists, these horrific individuals that showed up that day. But do you worry that the left has not condemned some of these other violent groups that we have seen, not just in Charlottesville, but really out throughout the country, groups like Antifa? Is there a concern that the left is not condemning these different groups?
Oh, there's a responsibility in order to not be hypocritical for the left to call out all of the elements that are the extreme on their side, responsible for violence against people, threats of violence against people. The Missouri state senator a couple days ago threatening, calling for the president's assassination. Those who show up to these protests with violent purposes and intentions, all of the celebrities on their side of the aisle, Kathy Griffin, Madonna, Johnny Depp, George Clooney, Shakespeare in the Park, Snoop Dogg, all these people who have reenacted killing and harming the president of the United States. The left has a responsibility to call that out, just like really all Americans have a responsibility to call out the KKK, anyone who associates with the KKK and Nazism. They are filled with evil, bigotry, intolerance that is un-American, it's unwelcome, it's wrong. I am here as a Republican willing to condemn any extremist element on our side responsible for all that hate and evil. There's a responsibility on the part of the left not to be hypocritical and to do the same for those in their party who will be at a rally talking about harming our police who keep us safe, protesting so many things that are good about what makes America the greatest country in the world. That is incredibly important for them to unite this country if they're genuinely interested in being united, and they don't just want to oppose, obstruct, resist this president entirely on everything and anything, because they say you can't work with this president because if you work with him, you'll normalize his presidency. Give me a break. I didn't vote for Barack Obama, but he was my president. They may not have voted for Donald Trump, but he is their president, and they should be rooting for his success, because his success as president of the United States is their success as Americans if they get their priorities in order and call out those extremist elements on their side.
Well, Congressman, we so appreciate you being here with us tonight. Thank you. And developing tonight, police in Spain still on the hunt for the driver in Thursday's terror attack in Barcelona. Joining me now with a reaction to the latest news and what it means for us here at home, former CIA counterterrorism officer Buck Sexton and a former Department of Homeland Security consultant, Mustafa Tamiz. Thank you both for being with us here tonight.
Thank you.
Buck, I want to start with you. So this attack in Spain marks the sixth kind where we've seen a vehicle used in a European nation to cause mass casualties. Is this the new normal in Europe?
Well, what's interesting in this case is that it seemed that they were actually trying to build what we would call VBIEDs, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, based on the bomb factory that went up and that actually was really, in some ways, the reason for the accelerated attack planning. This was a plan B for them, using the vehicles. Plan A was to use TATP, based on Spanish language reports, which is a homemade explosive that, by the way, is a hallmark of the Islamic State's previous either inspired or directed terrorist attacks in cities like Brussels, in Manchester, in Paris. So there have been a number of high-profile attacks using this explosive, but it is difficult to handle, and if you make a mistake, it can be your last, and that's why the house went up and they decided to go to vehicles instead. So this is a combination of different terror tactics that we've seen in the past, and quite honestly, Lisa, it actually could have been much worse than it was.
Well, we also know that ISIS has been pushing out propaganda, encouraging people to use vehicles for these kinds of attacks, sadly. Mustafa, I want to get to you, and I have a question for you. You know, the CIA has repeatedly or reportedly warned Spanish officials about an attack like this. Do you have any information on that, or can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that?
Well, there was a number of chatter about that there may be potentially attack in this. You know, the Spain has been somewhat fortunate in that there was a terror plot that was thwarted earlier. There was a lot of intelligence that something could happen there, but so far nothing had occurred. We've seen a lot of activity coming because of North Africa, but you know, here's the reality that we're all facing. ISIS has put out a call for people to, you know, act where they are, and that's been a very dangerous. We're seeing radical extremism, you know, for people to you know, take these homemade devices like cars and just ram them into people. So this is what's dangerous. What Buck is talking about, now taking it to the next level. Just imagine if they were able to take this, you know, these propane tanks and were able to take them into a populated tourist area, it would have been far, far, far worse.
And Mustafa, I also want to ask you just more broadly on ISIS. So we've seen President Trump ask for a comprehensive plan from Secretary Mattis, something that General Jack Keane has said President Obama never did. We've seen some gains in ISIS or in Syria and Iraq against ISIS as well. How do you think President Trump is doing in his fight against ISIS?
Look, I think we're making tremendous gains on the ground in Syria and Iraq. What we have to really do, and what we haven't done, is how do we fight the battle of the ideas? We're not doing enough in countering violent extremism on the net. We're not taking down enough websites. We're not taking down enough Twitter accounts. We've gotten more cooperation than we ever have on social media. But still, to this day, we haven't put together a comprehensive strategy to take down these websites and take down the YouTube videos. Anwar al-Awlaki, who we took down with a drone attack years and years ago. His videos to this day are still being used to radicalize youth, not just in Europe, but even within the United States. And we have to do a much better job to do that today.
But Buck, is taking down these websites, is that enough to combat this ideology? Because we've seen all these groups, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's ISIS, and they keep sprouting up and they all share the same ideology. So is simply just taking down these websites, is that enough? No,
it's not enough. And this is a challenge that we've been trying to deal with on the counter-radicalization side for the entirety of the post 9/11 era. We're still finding out a fair amount about these young men, a dozen or so of them, in a very large and complex terror cell. But at this point, some of the markers that you would expect for radicalization, some of the social media and other electronic signatures that you would think you'd see for somebody who had gone through a jihadization process, it's not there. These individuals, some of them are very young. They were considered to be among peers, well integrated, very westernized, and they weren't, as we've seen in some other attacks, by and large, well known to authorities as extremists. They weren't being watched because it was thought maybe they had returned from training with the Islamic State. So counter-radicalization in this case may involve a preacher, that's been reported, somebody who was a visiting preacher. And so you're going to have to try and stop that from happening, which is a very tall order. And quite honestly, up until this point, I think Spain and some of these European countries have done a pretty good job disrupting plots. But the problem is when one gets through, you have a mass casualty event like this. And there's a lot of other issues that you can bring into the discussion that I think should happen. Immigration policy is one of them. But counter-radicalization is something that we're going to continue to struggle with, not just for years, but for decades. Right. And Mustafa, real quick, you had mentioned North Africa. How big is ISIS's footprint right now across the world?
Well, we can begin to really take them down and shrink the ground in North Africa. I don't think we've done enough, but we can do more. But the global challenge is that we can't shrink their footprint on the internet. And that's what I was talking about, that we've got to find a much better way to shrink their footprint on the internet, because these communities on the internet begin to grow very rapidly. Someone on a laptop can do that. The other thing I want to talk about just briefly is that we've seen a lot of radicalization in prisons across Europe. We've seen these petty criminals that go in for very minor crimes in Europe and come out hardened, not just criminals, but hardened terrorists. And we have to do a much better job in working through prisons in Europe that we haven't done. We've seen a number of hardened terrorists come out of prisons in Europe that I think it's a growing phenomenon. Well,
Mustafa Buck, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it tonight. A second police officer killed after a violent night in America against our men and women in blue. We're talking about that next. And then more rallies and counter-protests in the wake of the Charlottesville violence. And all of it has sparked a debate over American history. We'll talk about that and so much more with Fox News contributor Colonel Alan West as justice rolls on in just a moment. Don't go away. Breaking tonight, heartbreak in Florida as a second police officer is now dead in Kissimmee after a gunman fired on officers. It was one of 3 shootings injuring several officers in Florida and Pennsylvania last night. Joining me now to talk about it is Dan Bongino, a former NYPD officer and a former Secret Service agent. Dan, thank you for being with us tonight.
So happy to be here.
Well, I wish it was under different circumstances, sir. So we saw, these shootings just last night. 6 police officers shot in Florida and Pennsylvania. 2 were killed, 4 injured. We saw 2 officers killed in the line of duty last weekend. It seems like we're hearing way too many of these stories about police deaths. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's because you are, Lisa, tragically. Think about it. Policing, the threat to police officers has grown geometrically. And outside of maybe some modifications in training, the tools they have, Lisa, are the exact same they had 30 and 40 years ago. They have some form of a firearm and an impact weapon, and you drive around in cars. I mean, the tools are the same, but the threat is far different. You have 2 things right now that you had, but you didn't have to the degree we have now, that you didn't have 30, 40 years ago. You have the growing threat of soft target terror assaults, which was always a threat, but now has grown, again, exponentially here. And then you also have a police environment as well, where it's seemingly okay among some groups, not all, but some groups, to dehumanize police, say things like pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon, which automatically, I think, instills upon people who are already angry at police officers a sense that it's okay to assault them and basically to dehumanize them and treat them as subhumans, which is totally unacceptable.
Well, Dan, you talk about those threats, and those numbers bear it out as well. You look at 2016, we saw a 56% increase in police officers who were killed in the line of duty. We also saw an increase to the tune of 167% in terms of ambush killings. So you talked about the tools and how they need to change. How do we change those tools? What tools do our police officers need so we can avoid statistics like the ones we just saw?
Well, it's a great question. And I think for the first group, these soft target terror type attacks, and there's no indication that the Kissimmee incident involved this, but this is a big threat. Police officers being ambushed by terrorist type groups. What you need to do is you have to be an arsonist, not a fireman here. I use this analogy all the time because it's critical your audience takes this away. Being a fireman and trying to solve these problems in the aftermath and break up cells after they've attacked a police officer or ambush someone is not going to work anymore. We have to transition to a fully arsonist type approach where we're starting the fires in advance. And what I mean by that is developing sources in the communities, cultivating those sources. And a lot of police officers and police departments are doing this. But we have to we need like a Marshall Plan for intelligence nationally at the federal, state, and local level because it works twofold. You don't just get at the guys in the community that are the rabble-rousers who are calling for hurting cops, but you also get, if you have really good sourcing, you also get those terror groups and you break those cells up in advance. So we're not putting out the fires after they've already ambushed a police officer. We can't let that happen.
Well, and you talked about building relationships.